Dawn over. Suribachi, February 23, 1945. The first light of February 23, 1945, revealed a landscape out of some fevered nightmare. From the black, blasted beaches of Iwo Jima, the massive hulk of Mount Suribachi loomed above the battlefield like a brooding giant. Smoke drifted across the slopes. Craters, shattered bunkers, and the gaping mouths of volcanic caves scarred its face. From those caves, unseen Japanese snipers waited like patient spiders, their rifles trained on every patch of broken rock below. At 8 a.m., Lieutenant Harold Schreier tightened the straps on his helmet, gripped his carbine, and led his 40-man patrol from Easy Company forward. Their mission was clear but deadly: climb to the summit and secure the high ground. No one needed to explain what it meant. For 6 days, the Americans had bled and died in the shadow of Suribachi. Japanese mortars and machine guns atop the volcano had turned the beaches into killing fields. Every man knew that the enemy would fight to the last. The sulphurous stench from the island's volcanic heart hung heavy in the morning air, burning in throats and stinging eyes. Every breath tasted of rotten eggs and gunpowder. Every step upward grew harder. The volcanic ash shifted and gave way under their boots, sapping strength and making the climb feel endless. Ropes were thrown over particularly steep sections, and Marines hauled themselves up hand over hand, muscles screaming from 6 days of relentless combat. Private First Class Raymond Jacobs, the patrol's radio man, later remembered the feeling of that morning vividly. Every muscle burned from days of fighting, but we knew taking that mountain might break the enemy's spirit. We weren't thinking about anything beyond the next step, the next rock. We had one thought: get up that mountain. What they couldn't know, what none of them could even imagine, was that their desperate climb would carve their names into American history. Japanese resistance was fierce but scattered. Grenades came rolling from hidden crevices. Shots cracked from unseen snipers. At several points, the patrol had to stop and clear out stubborn pockets of defenders, tossing grenades into dark tunnels or spraying machine gun fire into crevices. But the enemy was not massed in force on the slopes. Kuribayashi's strategy was clear: delay, inflict casualties, force the Americans to pay for every foot. Hours passed like years. The volcanic dust clung to their sweat-soaked skin, mixing with blood and grime until every Marine looked ghostly and hollow-eyed. Ammo ran low. Water was almost non-existent, and still they climbed, a grim, moving line of determined figures against the blasted gray of Suribachi's slope. Finally, just before 10 a.m., they reached the summit. The view took their breath away. To the north stretched the tortured battlefield of Iwo Jima, fields of twisted metal, burning tanks, and tiny figures scuttling across the beaches. Offshore, hundreds of American ships crowded the waters, their gun barrels pointed like accusing fingers at the island. In every direction, death and destruction ruled the day. Schreier quickly ordered a perimeter established. The Marines dug in, expecting a furious Japanese counterattack that never came. Then, from within his jacket, he produced a small American flag, no larger than a pillowcase. It had been given to him by Battalion Commander Chandler Johnson with simple, curt instructions. If you get to the top, put this up. The flag was hastily attached to a length of iron pipe scrounged from the wreckage below. Together, Schreier, Sergeant Henry Hansen, Corporal Charles Lindbergh, and others worked to hoist the flag into the rocky ground. It wasn't easy. The wind tore at the fabric, and the rocky soil offered little purchase. But at last, with a final shove, the stars and stripes unfurled in the sulphurous breeze. At that moment, a great cheer rose from the island below. Marines on the beaches, exhausted and bloodied, looked up and saw their flag flying atop the mountain that had dominated their world. Cries of "Ura" and "Semper Fi" echoed across the black sand. Men threw their helmets into the air, hugged each other, wept openly. From the decks of the ships offshore, Sailors and Marines whooped and cheered, the deep horns of the battleships sounding in triumphant chorus. It was a moment of rare, pure hope in the darkest of battles. On the summit, the Marines could see the reaction, hear the distant roar of approval. For a few heartbeats amidst the smoke and the death, they felt invincible. They had made it. They had seized the high ground. They had planted their flag. But the war was far from over. Unbeknownst to the men on Suribachi down below, Colonel Johnson had already ordered a second, larger flag to be raised. He didn't want the first one taken as a souvenir. That second flag raising, captured by Joe Rosenthal's camera, would become one of the most famous images in history, a symbol of valor, sacrifice, and stubborn endurance. And yet, for the men of Schreyer's patrol, the ones who carried the first flag up the treacherous slopes, the moment remained deeply personal. They hadn't done it for glory or fame. They had done it for each other, for their brothers still dying below, for the Marine Corps, and for a country that needed hope. Most of them would not survive the weeks of savage fighting still to come. Many would fall in the chaotic bloodbath of Iwo's northern plains, in places that would earn names like the Amphitheater, the Meat Grinder, and Death Valley. Their graves would be shallow ones, marked hastily in the shifting volcanic ash. Years later, survivors like Raymond Jacobs would speak softly of that morning, not in terms of heroism, but of duty, of sacrifice, of the overwhelming weight of war. They knew what the flag had cost, and what it truly meant. At dawn on Suribachi, the flag rose, fragile and defiant against a sky filled with smoke and sorrow. And with it rose the spirit of every Marine who had ever fought and bled for a scrap of ground, for a brother beside him, and for a home he might never see again. The first flag, a moment of hope. At exactly 10:20 a.m. on February 23, 1945, after a grueling firefight that left smoke hanging over the summit of Mount Suribachi like a funeral shroud, Sergeant Henry Hansen hammered a battered iron pipe into the volcanic rock. In his hands was more than just fabric and steel. He carried a small American flag, roughly 54 by 28 inches, pulled from the wreckage of a U.S. ship damaged at Pearl Harbor. The flag had seen the beginning of a war. Now it would witness one of its bloodiest battles. With muscles trembling from exhaustion and the constant threat of sniper fire humming in their ears, Hansen and his comrades hoisted the flag skyward. For a breathless moment, the cloth hesitated in the dead air, clinging to the pipe as if reluctant to let go. Then a Pacific gust caught the fabric, snapping it open in a bright burst of red, white, and blue against the smoky gray sky. Across the island, Marines paused. Bloodied men dragging wounded comrades stopped and looked up. On the black sand beaches, where the wounded cried out for medics and artillery shells still churned the earth, a roar rose. Helmets flew into the air. Ships at sea let loose their whistles and sirens in a cacophony of triumph. Officers, privates, Navy sailors, and Seabees alike shouted themselves hoarse. For the first time, the stars and stripes flew over Japanese home territory. For a few precious minutes, amidst the carnage and despair, there was hope. Marine photographer Lou Lowery, clambering up behind the patrol, captured the historic moment with his speed graphic camera. His hands shook as he snapped the images. He would later recall how, as he clicked the shutter, Japanese soldiers emerged like wraiths from hidden caves around the summit, opening fire. The celebration turned back into chaos almost instantly. Marines who had been cheering one moment were diving for cover the next. Sergeant Schreyer's men fought furiously to defend the summit, ducking behind rocks and firing back into the shadows. Grenades bounced across the uneven ground, bullets hissed through the air, and through it all, the small flag fluttered defiantly, visible to friend and foe alike. It became a beacon and a target. A captured Japanese officer would later admit that the defenders on Iwo Jima concentrated fire on the insulting banner, desperate to tear it down, to deny the Americans this symbol of victory. But the flag remained standing, bullet holes and all, a stubborn reminder that Mount Suribachi no longer belonged to Japan. Get a bigger flag! The birth of an icon. Down below, on the slopes and beaches, the small flag was barely visible. Secretary of the Navy. James Forrestal, who had come ashore to witness the battle firsthand, was overcome with emotion when he saw the stars and stripes against the sky. In a spontaneous declaration, he insisted that he wanted the flag as a personal memento, an artifact of American perseverance. Colonel Chandler Johnson, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, was furious when he heard the request. His men had bled and died for that flag. It would not be taken as a trophy by anyone, not even the Secretary of the Navy. "To hell with that," Johnson snapped. Without hesitation, he sent an order up the mountain. Raise another flag, a bigger one, something so large that every Marine on the beach could see it clearly. He handed off a larger American flag, requisitioned from a Navy LST, and ordered it to the summit along with a sturdy water pipe to serve as a makeshift flagpole. Shortly after noon, 6 men were assembled at the peak to carry out the task. They came from different corners of America, from different backgrounds, bound together by the horrors they had shared and the duty they still owed to the living and the dead. Sergeant Michael Strank, a quiet leader from Pennsylvania, beloved by his men, would fall to enemy fire just days later on March 1st. Corporal Harlan Block, a Texas boy, tough and dependable, would die alongside Strank the same day. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, barely 19 years old from Kentucky, whose death by sniper fire on March 21st would leave a small town back home in mourning. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona who would carry the scars of Iwo Jima for the rest of his short, tragic life. Private First Class René Gagnon, a runner from New Hampshire, chosen to help bring the second flag up the mountain. Pharmacist's mate John Bradley, a Navy corpsman from Wisconsin who had already seen more suffering and death than most men experience in a lifetime. Working quickly, under constant threat of sniper fire and Japanese counterattacks, they lashed the new flag to the heavy pipe. The larger flag was awkward, catching the Pacific wind like a sail, and it took the combined strength of the 6 men to raise it upright against the gusts. Nearby, Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal stumbled upon the scene. He hadn't come to the summit specifically to photograph the second flag raising. It was a stroke of chance, a photographer's instinct that made him lift his speed graphic camera and press the shutter. In a single 1/400th of a second exposure, he captured the image that would become immortal. The photograph showed none of the faces clearly. There were no smiles, no triumphal poses, only raw struggle, the backbreaking effort of men working together, pushing against the wind, against exhaustion, against death itself. It was an image of sacrifice and unity, not glory. The photo would flash across front pages back home within days, galvanizing a nation weary from years of war. It would help sell more war bonds than any poster, any speech. It would inspire memorials, monuments, and memories that would last for generations. But for the 6 men frozen in that iconic frame, there would be no fairy tale ending. 3 of them would never leave Iwo Jima alive, and those who did survive would carry the unseen wounds of that tiny volcanic island, the horrors of black sand and blood, forever. The photo that moved a nation. When Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the second flag raising on Mount Suribachi hit American newspapers on February 25, 1945, it sent a shockwave across the nation. The image, raw and unposed, showed 6 anonymous figures locked in a moment of pure effort, straining, not for glory, but simply to finish the job. To millions of Americans back home, Weary after nearly 4 years of war, the photo seemed to promise that the end was finally near. The flag, flying high over conquered Japanese territory, felt like a signal that the long, bloody climb toward victory was almost over. Headlines screamed triumph. Editorials hailed the indomitable spirit of the American fighting man. Cities erupted into spontaneous parades. But what the public didn't know, not yet, was the heartbreaking truth behind the image. Of the 6 men in that photograph, 3 were already dead or would die in combat within weeks. The fighting on Iwo Jima, far from finished, was only entering its deadliest phase. Mount Suribachi had fallen, but the northern half of the island, a twisted hellscape of volcanic rock, deep bunkers, and hidden caves, would claim thousands more lives before the battle ended. Even the flag raising itself, the moment that had been immortalized, wasn't as simple as it seemed. The first flag raising, earlier that morning, had involved brutal close-quarters fighting under direct enemy fire. It had been done by exhausted, battered Marines clinging to the side of an active volcano, facing snipers who could and did kill them at any moment. That flag raising had been a miracle of grit and survival. The second raising, the one captured by Rosenthal's camera, came amidst relative chaos, with Marines scrambling to fulfill an urgent order to hoist a bigger, more visible flag. It had been over in seconds, a blur of effort captured in a blink of the lens. Still, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, recovering from illness but still sharp as ever, immediately saw the photograph's power. He ordered the surviving flag raisers brought back to the United States. They would become the living faces of a massive war bond drive, one last desperate push to finance the final offensives against Japan and Germany. For the American people, the photo became a beacon of hope. For the Marines still fighting and dying on Iwo Jima's black sands, it was a distant, almost irrelevant symbol. The enemy hadn't surrendered. They hadn't stopped killing. If anything, the Japanese resistance grew even more desperate and lethal after Suribachi fell. Private First Class Richard Wheeler, himself wounded days later, captured the bitter truth best. That photo gave America hope, but for us still fighting, it just meant more Japanese wanted to kill us. The heavy price of heroism. While Americans celebrated the image, the reality for the men in the photograph and for their comrades was anything but glorious. Sergeant Michael Strank, the quiet leader of the group and the man guiding the flag raising in Rosenthal's photo, was the first to die. Just 6 days after the photograph was taken, on March 1st, 1945, Strank was killed instantly when an errant shell, likely fired by supporting American artillery, exploded near him. He was 25 years old. In the chaos of war, there was no time for ceremony. His men buried him hastily in the island's ashen soil. Moments later, Corporal Harlan Block, the Marine seen at the base of the flagpole, was killed in nearly the same spot. A mortar round tore into his lower body. Though mortally wounded, Block tried to crawl toward his fellow Marines before dying. Tragically, he was misidentified in official records, and his mother in Texas was initially told that her son had survived. Only years later would the truth come out. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, a 19-year-old farm boy from Hilltop, Kentucky, survived longer, but not by much. On March 21st, as the battle ground toward its bloody conclusion, Sousley was shot in the back by a sniper while walking away from a captured position. Mortally wounded, he cried out for his mother with his last breaths. "Mom! Mom!" His buddies knelt around him, helpless. 3 of the 6 flag raisers dead before the end of March, their faces frozen in time, while their bodies were left broken in the volcanic dust. For the 3 survivors, the burden of survival would prove a different kind of death sentence. Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona, never found peace after Iwo Jima. Haunted by guilt over the deaths of his comrades, he shrank from the public adoration thrust upon him during the Bond tours. He hated being paraded before crowds, hated the endless speeches about heroism when he knew the real heroes lay buried on the island. After the war, he drifted into chronic alcoholism, unable to exorcise the ghosts of Iwo Jima. He was found dead in 1955, face down in a muddy ditch on his reservation, at only 32 years old. Private First Class René Gagnon struggled under the crushing weight of fame he neither sought nor understood. Plucked from the ranks and treated like a national icon, he found himself adrift in civilian life. Jobs came and went. His marriage faltered. The dreams of parades and honors faded into obscurity. Gagnon died in 1979, virtually penniless, still wrestling with the expectations that had been placed on him. Pharmacist's mate John Bradley, the Navy corpsman who had risked his life for Marines countless times on Iwo Jima, returned to Wisconsin and built a quiet life as a funeral director. He rarely spoke of the battle, never boasted of the flag raising. Even when his son, James Bradley, later wrote the best-selling book, Flags of Our Fathers, it was revealed that John had carried the memories of Iwo Jima like a stone around his neck until his dying day in 1994. The price of that single perfect photograph, the hope it symbolized, the legend it created, was paid in full by the blood and broken lives of the men who raised the flag, and by thousands more who fought and died unseen. The image moved a nation, but it haunted the survivors forever. The legacy in bronze and memory. The image captured atop Mount Suribachi did not end with the final gunshots of World War II. It lived on, first in newspapers, then in history books, and finally in bronze, soaring above the nation it had inspired. On November 10, 1954, the 179th birthday of the United States Marine Corps, the Marine Corps War Memorial was officially dedicated just outside Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. It was not simply a monument, it was a colossal tribute to all Marines who had given their lives in defense of the country since 1775. But for most Americans, and certainly for the veterans who gathered in the cool autumn air that day, it would forever be the Iwo Jima Memorial. Each towering figure on the memorial stands 32 feet tall, frozen in the moment of triumph and struggle captured by Joe Rosenthal's camera lens. The bronze flagpole they raise stretches 60 feet into the sky, and by presidential proclamation, the American flag flies there day and night, a perpetual vigil over the sacrifices it represents. The surviving flag raisers, those who could bear the emotional weight, attended the dedication ceremony. Ira Hayes, whose life had spiraled into tragedy after the war, stood among them, uncomfortable under the gaze of so many, burdened by memories too heavy to voice. As speeches lauded their bravery and crowds offered thunderous applause, Hayes spoke quietly to a reporter nearby. "People see heroes. I just see my buddies who never came home." That day, Hayes would slip away from the celebration, choosing solitude over spotlight, lost in private grief that no monument, no matter how grand, could ever soothe. For many veterans, the memorial evokes a complex tide of emotion. Pride, yes, but also sorrow, longing, and the ache of memory. The statue stands as a tribute not to easy victory, but to the terrible price that was paid in places like Iwo Jima, where nearly 7,000 Marines died clawing their way across an island barely 8 square miles in size, smaller than Manhattan, but soaked with more blood per acre than almost any battlefield in American history. The flag, raised high and eternal over the memorial, whispers to every passing generation, "Remember." Why this story still matters. For those who lived through 1945, the story of Iwo Jima is not just a distant historical chapter. It is etched into memory as vividly as the day it happened. They remember the newspaper headlines, the newsreels flickering in black and white, the parades of returning heroes, and the aching silence for those who never came home. But even for later generations, for all Americans, the story still carries weight because it reminds us what freedom costs. The cost of freedom. Iwo Jima demanded 6,821 marine lives, a staggering toll for an island most had never heard of before 1945. Thousands more were wounded, many grievously. Every inch of volcanic rock was paid for in flesh and blood. No one at the time knew if it would end the war faster, but they fought as if it would, giving everything so that others might live. The power of symbols. A single photograph, a split-second capture, became an icon for an entire nation. It transcended the battle itself, coming to represent American perseverance, sacrifice, and unity. But symbols, powerful as they are, can sometimes obscure the reality behind them. The flag raising was not a moment of easy triumph. It was a fragile, costly victory carved from exhaustion and fear. The human truth. Beneath the soaring ideals and bronze statues were scared young men, most barely out of high school, who didn't seek fame or glory. They simply did their duty. They faced terror with trembling hands and broken hearts. They stumbled forward through gunfire and darkness, not because they were fearless, but because they refused to abandon each other. Today, as the generations of World War II slowly pass into history, the meaning of Iwo Jima becomes even more precious. It is not merely a battlefield frozen in time. It is a testament to courage, to sacrifice, and to the enduring spirit of ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The Marine Corps War Memorial stands silhouetted against countless sunsets, its flag catching the breeze, not as a relic of the past, but as a living promise that we will remember, that we will honor. Visual close. A slow, reverent zoom on the memorial at sunset. The figures are bathed in golden light, their bronze faces forever straining upward. In the background, the haunting notes of a lone bugle playing taps drift on the evening air. As the camera tightens on the flag rippling against the fading sky, the scene gently dissolves to the original black-and-white Rosenthal photograph. 6 men, mid-struggle, caught forever in the act of lifting more than just a flag, lifting the hopes of an entire nation. Fade to black.